It is 20 minutes to 12 o'clock, and we welcome Prof. Alex van der Heever, Universal Healthcare Access Coalition Steering Committee member, and from the Wits School of Governance. It's great to have you with us, Prof.
Hi, good morning.
There's been a lot of debate about the finance model for NHI and whether it's practical or not. Let's understand, I think, first and foremostly, what the difference between your proposed healthcare framework is and the NHI Act.
So there are quite a few differences in the detail in that the proposal itself focuses on reforming our system as it exists, as opposed to a sort of a so-called radical change. But the fundamental distinction is that in the NHI proposal, they assume that they can provide the entire universal coverage package through a tax finance system. And that is technically impossible. The other feature is that they propose to combine the functions of what's called pooling, the resource allocation and insurance functions of the health system with the purchasing functions. In other words, the pooler buys the healthcare services at the same time, which is completely impractical. So the framework that we've got, first of all, separates out the pooling functions from the purchasing functions in that they remain decentralized. And the other is that it does not rely, the universal coverage objective is not achieved through a single fund. It is achieved through both the tax regime, both the tax-funded regime, the public system, plus the contributors in the medical scheme system. That is the only way to ensure universal coverage, is combining tax with people who are prepared to contribute over and above their tax contributions to a medical scheme. That ensures that we will basically have a bigger system than would be possible if you only tax funded it. So this is the framework that's therefore developed, says, well, what needs to happen for the public system to work better and what needs to happen for the private system to work better. These issues have been discussed extensively over the last 25 years. They're well understood. And certainly the experiences in the last 10 years in the public system have shown that there is systemic corruption that is impacting on the performance of the system, which needs to be removed. So we focus on what gets rid of that. And on the private sector side, there was a 5-year inquiry by the Competition Commission into how to structurally intervene in the private sector to get it to work effectively. And we have made it very clear what that framework is. In combination, you get a very solid universal coverage model, and you don't have to try and retrofit everything into a single public fund, which is just not feasible.
The noble objective of NHI, is that the same as the proposal that you are making?
Yes, the objective is the same. Universal health coverage. The only difference is the model that is proposed by the UHAC framework is feasible. The NHI one is an objective only and is not technically feasible. And the risk is that pursuing that route means that we don't actually engage in any of the reforms that are necessary to improve our health system, because they're just going to wait forever to do anything until they supposedly have implemented NHI, which means basically nothing will happen for the foreseeable future.
So essentially, it's a mix of tax money and medical scheme contributions to fund health care rather than just one big government fund that NHI suggests, and the objectives remain the same. And you say this is because of the very pervasive corruption that we have in South Africa.
So in the public sector, first of all, there's a limit to how much you can raise from general taxes. Basically, we are at tax capacity, and this is going to be the case going forward. That means you can't actually increase tax rates and get more money, because we're at a limit where if you increase tax rates any further, you're actually going to reduce the revenue that government takes in, because it will introduce incentives to evade, avoid, and have impact on economic output. So National Treasury has acknowledged we're at tax capacity. At tax capacity, no more money comes in other than from economic growth. So you have to supplement the money we have for healthcare through the co-contributions coming in through medical schemes. So unless you, and that keeps the whole population out of the public sector, and they're self-funding it predominantly with money from their own disposable incomes after tax. So it basically means that you've got a system which, if you regulate that part properly, remains affordable and is sustainable and can carry quite a lot of people and keep them out of the public sector tax-funded component. It doesn't mean that you don't have people using the public sector, but if they do, then the medical scheme pays for it. So this framework makes a lot of sense if you develop it properly. The concern is that there is no incentive in government at the moment to stop the corruption. And so these proposals that are contained in this report require that the executive of government is separated from the operational aspects of the public health system, and that a large part of the system is made operationally also more autonomous. But with that comes the requirement for the intervention of independent supervisory structures and boards that oversee major hospitals and district health authorities. And that separation from the executive of government eliminates the ability of members of the executive to set up networks of extraction, which is really what is happening in the public sector at the moment. There's no way to stop it until you stop a politician from basically arranging an array of people that go into the public sector, and basically they're on every side of every tender, and there's nobody who can actually apply checks and balances.
You're also alluding maybe to something. I'm chatting to Prof. Alex van den Heever, representing the Universal Healthcare Access Coalition Steering Committee member from Wits School of Governance, and a proposal that is now tabled effectively by this group, the Universal Healthcare Access Coalition. More practical plan, they say, that could be put into action sooner and wouldn't require raising taxes too much. It sounds like win. But let's understand the regulation that you want to see come through in the private sector. What kind of form should that regulation take?
So there's been a number of inquiries and processes that have existed since 1994. That have all basically come up with the same framework, and this was very much solidified in the Health Market Inquiry Report that was finalized in 2019. So what it requires is that there are a number of structural interventions. It's not regulation like a telephone directory that has some central regulator determining everything you do. It's about structural recommendations. So the key structural one was risk equalization, which means that medical schemes, the urge to compete on the basis of demographics and people with pre-existing conditions is removed through a system of risk equalization, in that every scheme faces the risk profile of the entire system. Without going into the complications of that, what it means is that at the end of the day, schemes don't compete on demographics anymore. What they do is they compete on the value for money of their purchases, of how they engage with service providers. That's one key intervention. The other one is transparency in the system. Yeah. The implementation of information regulators, the introduction of social reinsurance to allow entry of small players into the system, and so those are key parts of the overriding framework. There are other more detailed ones, including the way in which prices are determined in the system through multilateral price negotiation. All of those have been recommended by the market inquiry after a 5-year investigation and then engagement. So those are supported and reflect recommendations that were made in the Taylor Committee of Inquiry in 2002, various inquiries and analyses since then. But basically, because the NHI process had said no, medical schemes won't exist, they basically won't introduce any regulation that will actually stabilize the system, which is a scandal. Because people want to point to the private sector and say, look, its costs are excessive. Look, we can't rely on that system. But they've held back on the very reforms that government processes have identified need to be introduced. So in these, the coalition's recommendations, they have actually not made recommendations different to what official processes have recommended up to date.
Just two things. You argue for the depoliticization of health in this particular country. Are there such examples around the world that we could look at?
Well, in many countries, look, the fundamental problem you have. So first of all, you can look at specific examples. So one is you can look at a negative example. You can look at the United States at present. You can see how systematic state capture occurs. It occurs through political structures where you interfere in the administration and you basically take them over, invade them with massive conflicts of interest, and it allows you to use the state for corrupt purposes. We've had that in South Africa continuously all through the gaps of political appointment. So if we look at the National Health Service in the UK, they don't allow political appointments into the system at all. They have independent boards that are set up, and there is an independent structure of vetting for people who go into these supervisory boards, and they have powers of supervision. They can hire and fire the chief executives of any of the entities they're supervising. And basically what it does is it means that they're operating in accordance with a very clear strategic mandate, and they hold the operational executives to account on what they do. You don't allow in any structure that allows a conflict of interest between a supervisory structure and the entity carrying out business means that effectively there is no supervision. So we've operated through much of government with that kind of conflict of interest to date. That's why the SOEs have failed. That's why many of the public entities that have lots of money have faced immense problems because they are targets for capture because of the amount of procurement they're involved in. So this is one thing that, say, the NHI Act is totally silent on. It reinforces all the existing conflicts of interest in the governance arrangements. This would also extend to regulators. So you can't have regulators where you have ministerial appointments into them because it allows for a political conflict of interest. Now it dampens any attempt by that regulator to actually go after people who are politically connected ends through the pressure that comes through politically. So there's no way you can run a proper public health system and a health system unless you eliminate those conflicts. So we're basically recommending that through the entire public health system regime, that the separation is structurally introduced. And if it isn't structurally introduced, nothing will change. And this is why many people are very concerned about the continuation of the status quo. The NHI doesn't change the status quo, it reinforces it. And that basically is a concern. We are going to continue having our public services robbed blind because of this. Plus, our regulatory structures are ineffective because of the political conflict. And we've got a large number of health-related regulators that are quite critical and need to operate independently.
And maybe they must come into management. I see you still proposing a provincial structure. Many point to that structure as being an unnecessary duplication of bureaucratic, administrative, and political function at great expense to the core business of the health department. Just talk to us about that proposal that you're making in terms of the structure around the country.
So what it says is that there isn't any need to change the fact that provinces are responsible for the healthcare that is provided within the province. The one thing that we are first of all saying is that to correct the imperfections, the MECs can't appoint anybody into the system. They've got to focus on strategic policy, not on being able to interfere in any operational decision. That's the first issue. The second is that there's quite a lot of decentralized. This basically doesn't duplicate anything. There's nothing at national level that does any of these functions. And these are very large, very complex organizations.
I'm talking, we've got 9 provinces and therefore duplication around 9 provinces. Can't we condense that particular structure a little more so?
Not without a loss of political accountability. So what you actually want to do at the end of the day is to have those governments responsible to the populations, to the electorates within those regions. If they fail in performing, then basically you need to kick them out. But if we basically dampen that, who do you hold to account for the provision of services that are actually very important, close to the ground?
And those are your elected representatives, yeah.
And that creates a strong link. It's a kind of a social contract you want to build on. And I would say that South Africa is busy learning how to really exercise their sort of social power in relation to their regional governments. We're not there yet, but the point is there's nothing wrong with that as an overriding model. What is needed is that you don't want people to use the political power that they've gained within a province to concentrate power through patronage In other words, that somebody gets elected and is allowed to use that position to steal from the state and use that money to bribe everybody to keep them in a position of political power. That's part of what we're seeing in the dynamic. That's the problem. The way to end that is basically to sever their ability to interfere in public entities, to completely close that gap off so that patronage can't be the basis for political competition. The duplication of administrations is not really a big issue. If they are, but the conflicts of interest are the issue.
Yeah. Let's just wrap up this conversation. How amenable is government to other ideas? They look rather intransigent at this moment.
Yeah, they're not very open to, I would argue that they're not terribly interested in anything that impacts on the political patronage structures that are operating in the state. So you'll see backing off from dealing with any of those issues. So that's why there is really no movement to deal with all the corruption we have in the public sector. So there is this pretense that NHI will somehow, through the way in which they contract the hospitals and public services, change that behavior. That's utter nonsense. There's no way you change the behavior without governance reform at the level of the hospital itself. So they're avoiding the issue. So that's part of the reason for the problem, the intransigence. No political will to actually address the systemic problems in the system because there are too many people benefiting from them. And this also includes the private system as well. The problem there is that the regulatory requirements for the private system are also important to stabilize that system. But if that system got stable, then it becomes a counter narrative to the idea that, well, we've got a rubbish private sector and we need to sort of take it over with a national structure.
Sure.
And that's been the hold up on any kind of pragmatic reform of the private system. So we've had nothing for 20 years. These are major problems. We should be on an incremental basis be making interventions to improve both public and private sector systems over time. It takes conscious, focused government effort to do that. And basically, NHI has become an excuse to do nothing. And because they say we're implementing this grand scheme and we've got all sorts of vested interests against us that are holding us up. But actually, it's not the vested interest holding them up. They can't do it, but it's the excuse for them not addressing any of the real concerns in the health system. And they have to be called out on that. So yeah, I expect the intransigence to continue, but this process is to build up the reform framework and develop a coherent consensus on the people who are operating within the system, who are experts on the health system, to actually start deepening this conversation.
Yeah.
And they will get to that point where the government is yet with us, but ultimately they will have to come to the party.
Well, I think it's worth exploring more. Maybe you want to get a copy of it. It is, of course, Universal Healthcare Access Coalition Steering Committee's proposal that enables the universal healthcare that we'd like to see in this particular country, maybe a more practical framework to achieve that objective. From Prof. Alex van der Heer, for your time is appreciated.